So the much anticipated meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping of China took place yesterday on the sidelines of the Brics summit in Kazan in Russia. Truly a meeting that a lot of analysts, experts, diplomats were waiting for in terms of what it meant for the bilateral relationship as well as for the border crisis that India and China have been dealing with over the last 4 years. Joining me now to unpack this is Sahib Singh Chadha, who is a research analyst at Carnegie India, someone who looks very closely at the India-China relationship as well as China's foreign and security policy. Sahib, thank you so much for joining us. We took some of your time yesterday in the run-up to the meeting. Now, of course, the meeting is done. Could you tell us your initial thoughts, your initial takeaways from the meeting between these two leaders?
So the meeting took place yesterday, and the Indian statement was slightly shorter. The Chinese statement was a bit longer, but it was not just the readout from this meeting. It was the fact that the FS made a few remarks on 21st and 22nd. So just putting it all together, what do we know about the border situation? We knew both sides were attempting to arrive at an agreement for disengagement in Depsang and Depchok. So we have had an agreement on patrolling, and if it's implemented, it's supposed to lead to disengagement and to a pre-April 2020 situation where you are able to patrol and graze where applicable in Depsang and Depchok. The agreement is going to be implemented on the ground. It's only been reached day before, early morning. The other areas where the disengagement had taken place, which are Pangong, Galwan, and Bogra hot springs, those are outside of the scope of this agreement, and so those have not been touched. So that means the buffer zones still exist in those areas. The leaders have endorsed this agreement, and the Indian side has called it an agreement for complete disengagement, while the Chinese side has used a more ambiguous term called resolution, and that is generally the position they've taken. They try not to label it exactly disengagement. But from the readout from the Chinese side of President Xi and Prime Minister Modi's meeting, what is sort of still concerning is that the Chinese say that we should prevent specific disagreements from affecting the overall relationship. So in a nutshell, they disagree that the border situation should affect the broader relationship, whereas India's stance has been that, China's actions in April and May 2020 and June 2020 have brought the border to the front and center of the relationship. Now, China has in the past conceded that, the border situation is important for overall relations, but it is slightly concerning to see that, in a leader level statement in a meeting that's taken place after 4 years of a very tense standoff, I must say, that is still not present. So that is what I have on the border situation. On the broader situation, there are a few takeaways as well.
Right. So, a very interesting thing that you said about the Chinese statement as well as the Indian statement, and I was struck by it as well because when you talk about the Indian statement, there was, of course, as you were mentioning, complete disengagement and resolution. Allow sort of the proper management of the border, taking a big focus in the Indian statement, also adding a lot of specificity. There's a lot of conversation about pushing the dialogue forward at the level of foreign ministers as well as other senior leaders, as well as meetings of the special representatives. Fewer details in the Chinese statement. Is that just simply how the Chinese write statements, or is there some daylight between what the two countries have said about what happened at that meeting?
So, one, it is the manner in which the Chinese write these statements. They are less clear, more ambiguous, and I think my reasoning is that later, if things don't work out as intended, you can evade sort of. You can say that you didn't say it explicitly. There were some differences between both sides' statement. The Indian side statement, as you mentioned, specified the border a lot more, whereas the Chinese statement had less emphasis on the border. The Chinese statement was more about the bigger strategic picture, which is not surprising, but it's still worrying because China views India as part of this bigger strategic picture rather than the relationship with India on its bilateral merits. And whereas for India, again, it's front and center. But I want to draw your attention to another statement released by the Chinese Ministry of National Defense about a week back, where it says that the Quad is a sheer political tool for the US to contain China and maintain its hegemony. And we require relevant countries, and India is part of the Quad, to give up their obsession with zero-sum games. So that to me portrays that one of the fundamental misunderstandings in India-China relations about India's relationship with the United States, that has not gone away.
Mm-hmm.
So that is on that, and it is a positive development that the special representatives process is going to be taken forward, not just for the resolution of the boundary question, but also in the interim of maintaining peace and tranquility in the border area. So that's definitely a positive step.
Understood. Can I ask you a little bit then about moving forward, what we are likely to see in the India-China relationship? We've had some discussion now about, in the coming months, what does this mean for the border situation? What are the next steps going to be taken by the militaries on the ground to sort of carry out that larger disengagement? What are the big questions, whether it's Chinese infrastructure that has been built up over the last 4 years, what happens to that, as well as these buffer zones that we've had in parts of the LAC where we've had disengagements? How does this work? What are the next steps moving forward for the two militaries on the ground?
So, given this agreement, External Affairs Minister recently said that, if this agreement is basically adhered to, it will create conditions for going back to peace and tranquility. Broader economic engagement remains to be seen, and I think the extent of that engagement will depend on peace and tranquility in the border areas. Now, as I said yesterday, both sides are comfortable enough with the border situation as it stands. They were comfortable enough to have this meeting, and the meeting was, of course, a step to take forward the process of resolving the border situation, and bringing the India-China relationship back on track. So, what are the next steps? You have this agreement on patrolling that has to be implemented. You have to, and that'll lead to disengagement. Then in all the other areas that you disengaged in and presently have temporary buffer zones, you have to work out arrangements for resuming patrolling in those areas. Then you'll have de-escalation of troops. Then you'll have de-induction, and you will constantly assess whether peace and tranquility in the border areas is, in fact, you can say that the border areas are now peaceful.
Right, Saib, if I could just interrupt you for a second, and if you could do us the and explain to us, do us a service by explaining to us, these phrases, right? Disengagement, de-escalation, de-induction. If you could just, it's being bandied about a lot. If you could just explain to our viewers what those three things mean specifically, and then we can get into the weeds of what will happen moving forward.
So disengagement actually now it means that troops pull back from an eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation, which is what was the case in Galwan, in the Pangong Tso North and South, and in the Gogra Hot Springs area. In the Depsang and Demchok, it's slightly different. Troops were not actually eyeball-to-eyeball. It was that Indian patrols were being blocked at Y Junction. They could not go beyond Y Junction to go up to their patrolling points. And similarly, Chinese patrols were also being blocked whenever they came up. And they could not go to Goods. And similar situation was there in Demchok, where both sides were blocking at the Charding Ninglang Nala junction. So disengagement means actually a slightly different thing in Depsang and Demchok. De-escalation is that troops sort of the reserves, the forces that you have amassed, they go back to their bases, and they are not in the present quasi sort of wartime deployment that we have at present. And de-induction is a further reduction of troops in those areas.
Understood. So, you've done us a favor of explaining what exactly will happen moving forward. Could you also explain, now some of the conversations we've seen about the broader India-China relationship? Could I ask for your sense of, one of the big conversations, at least in the strategic community, has been that for the last couple of years, India has been thinking about its position on, for example, Chinese investments. Chinese investments into India face some restrictions after the COVID-19 pandemic and after the border crisis broke out. Now some conversations, especially with the economic ministries in India, saying that perhaps we should reconsider our approach to Chinese investments. China, as you were mentioning, is much more interested in resetting some of the broader aspects of this relationship, perhaps also trade and the economy. Could I ask you, how do you suspect, perhaps, forgive me for asking you to speculate, how do you suspect these conversations on letting investments in from China more freely, visas for Chinese professionals coming into India, do you think that these things are going to proceed in lockstep, these other parts of the strategic relationship, or do you think India will wait for a disengagement process to finish before saying that okay, now we can look with the sit down with the Chinese and look at resetting some other broader aspects of the relationship. How do you think that broader conversation is going to play out?
So I think government of India, especially the finance ministry, others, they're already deliberating on this question of economic engagement with China, and you have seen a few investment approvals go through. But the broader question is whether these investments are beneficial, whether in terms of they bring in technology, capital, whether they give Indians jobs, and whether they allow you to build up your industry in a way that you can actually export goods. So that is a critical question, whether these investments are actually beneficial to India or are they beneficial to China. I mean, an ideal arrangement would be that they would be beneficial to both, but they cannot just be beneficial to the Chinese in terms of the Chinese have an area and they have a market and they sort of reap the benefits of the investment. So one investment on its own, that is, it needs to be assessed. Whether it proceeds in lockstep or generally, I think as the border situation continues to hopefully get better, this economic engagement will slightly increase more. And it's not just economic engagement. The other aspects of the relationship, the statements and the remarks by the foreign secretary yesterday, the remarks indicate that other engagement is also going to pick up. One, you mentioned the special representatives mechanism, but there is now a broader push to enhance the dialogue, strategic communication between both sides. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because meeting isn't a bad thing, communicating isn't a bad thing. You are communicating your interests. It doesn't take away from your interests. And I think that's important to state, because there's been a lot of debate that you shouldn't have dialogue or engagement with China because it would compromise on your interests. I think it would allow you to communicate your interests more. I just want to go back to the border for a second.
Sure.
There was something very interesting in the Indian statement, which was that Prime Minister Modi underscored the importance of not allowing differences on boundary-related matters to disturb peace and tranquility on the borders. That's essentially saying that, yes, you have differences on the boundary and, you have overlapping perceptions of the LAC, but you adhere to the border peace and tranquility agreement. You adhere to the other confidence-building measures so that peace and tranquility isn't disturbed. You don't have any unilateral attempts to change the status quo, and you don't have violence. To a question, the foreign secretary also said that, in these new discussions that will be happening, the confidence building measures will, in his mind at least, certainly be a part of these conversations, and how to evolve them and adapt them to the new situation. And so that's an important point, because there's been a lot of chatter that these agreements are dead in the water. They don't hold relevance. China doesn't abide by agreements. The government of India clearly still attaches importance to these agreements.
Right. If I could ask you some two final questions just to understand where we are and where we're moving, how would you rate? Could I ask you to reflect then? Now that we're sitting at this moment, perhaps a little too early, but I'll ask you anyway. How do you reflect on how the government of India has handled the border crisis since over the last 4 years, its diplomatic strategy, as well as how it's dealt with the Chinese on the military side of the relationship? There are some, of course, who argue that, look, this is in some senses a vindication of how the government has handled the border crisis of the last 4 years. We've seen some people say that because now you have the Chinese talking about it. India did not give way on the border or push for an early resolution. Now you have both countries and with China agreeing to disengage across the line of actual control. Some people are saying this is a victory of patient diplomacy. Others are saying it's a little too early to say whether this has been a vindication of how New Delhi has managed what has happened on the border over the last 4 years. Do you have a personal sense of how you're seeing this?
So I think, given that you had standoffs in 2013, 2014, 2015, 2017, I think 2020 served as an inflection point, and government took a call that, this can't go on any longer. And it was a tough call to take, because engagement with China was an important part of India's foreign policy, let's say. So it was a tough call to take, and it's been tough to adhere to it over the past 4 years, despite the pressure that the Chinese have tried to exert. I mean, it's not been easy to disengage, not just right now, but even in the past. It only moved forward because India had a counter operation, Operation Snow Leopard, in September 2020, which was a new level of risk and signified that India was also willing to escalate in a counter escalate in a manner and have and use force.
Right.
So I think that was an important
Saib,
decision.
if I can ask you to lay out the details, because it's something that I often also find interesting, talking about Operation Snow Leopard and how the Indian military also decided to take on some offensive actions on the LAC. Could you explain that to our viewers, just to explain what the Indian military did in August of 2020 once the crisis broke out?
So basically, this operation came on the back of. So this was it took place at the end of August 2020. And where were we at the end of August 2020? After Galwan, after an initial conversation between co-commanders, after NSA Doval and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi had a conversation on 5th July, the disengagement process had started to move forward. But I think by the end of July, it had started to slow down. Galwan was the only place where you really had disengagement of any sort, and the other places it was stuck. And the meetings, the Chinese were basically stalling in the meetings. So, given this context, this decision was taken to escalate, and we decided to move armor tanks up to Rezangla, Rechenla, which was unprecedented because you couldn't have imagined having that sort of equipment at those heights of 5,000 meters and above. And it was tactically important because from those heights, you had a view of China's garrison at Moldo, uh, near the south bank of Pangong. So, and you could interdict logistics there. So it was a threat to the Chinese, to put it simply. And that operation really, at least Indian interlocutors maintain that that operation brought the Chinese to the negotiating table. And it was not just the military, it was the fact that that was coordinated with political level messaging. So 3-4 days after the operation, Raksha Mantri met his counterpart, I think Wei Fenghe, in Moscow on the sidelines of the SCO defense ministers meeting. And the meeting took place at the request of the Chinese side. I'll say that much. And that meeting really helped sort of break the thaw. That was the first in-person political dialogue you had since the standoff began. And then 6 days later, you had the external affairs ministers meeting on 10 September. And there were differences in that meeting as well, but there was enough consensus, and both sides saw a way out of the crisis. And they had an inklings of a framework to resolve this crisis, such that they ended up putting out a joint statement. So Operation Snow Leopard, in that sense, was significant, backed with political messaging in getting the Chinese to the negotiating table and moving forward on disengagement.
Understood. Azab, if I could ask you one last question in terms of whether we are at a new normal with China on the border. Over the last 4 years, we've seen a consistent effort to step up border infrastructure along the line of actual control. We have seen more willingness to work more closely with other powers that may share our views on China. There's also been some work on defense procurement. Could I ask you, do you believe that that level of defense preparedness that India has been willing to push over the last 4 years, do you think that will continue? Or do you believe that because we now have some semblance of a border patrolling agreement, we have a negotiating process that is ongoing, do you think that level of threat perception from China will come down, and therefore this level of defense preparedness will also come down? Do you believe that do you believe that we've reached a new normal and that we're not going back when it comes to our threat perception of China? We will continue to build infrastructure, continue to modernize our forces, continue to bolster our defense posture when it comes to China. What do you think?
I think the experience of the past 4 years has once and for all, not for all, but definitely for the near future, convinced us that, and sort of driven home the threat and the challenge that the Chinese present, not just on the border, but in broader regional and global geopolitics. And scholars have written about this, diplomats have written about this, that we're now going to be in a situation of armed coexistence for the next decade. I don't think anyone's buying that, and I don't think anyone has the reason to believe that this first meeting means that we are in a reset, or in a sort of, India can let its guard down. So I think the military deployments It remains to be seen whether it will come down. Of course, if the agreements are adhered to, it will come down. But I think the emphasis on Indian industry, indigenization, weapons procurement, I think that will certainly continue, and the border infrastructure build-up will also continue. I just want to come back to your previous question about the government of India's strategy.
Sure.
What in crisis there is always opportunity, and what we've seen in this crisis is that it led to a more holistic decision making between the military arms and the diplomatic arms of the Indian government. In the WMCC meetings, you had representatives from the Indian Army, and likewise when you had the co-commander meetings at the border, you had the Joint Secretary of the East Asia Division and the MEA joining for those meetings. So there was synergy, and this was important because the Chinese would say different things to PLA, would say different things to the co-commanders, and the diplomats would say different things to the Ministry of External Affairs. So having that synergy ensured that we could take a common line, but also receive a common line from the Chinese side. So I think that's something that we have done well in the past 4 years. And again, it is a tough decision, and EM also said this in his recent remarks, that it took longer than it should have, which just goes to sort of show the sort of pressure that India has been under. And I'm not saying that that pressure is going to go away. It's begun, as Foreign Secretary said, that the path to normalization, वो यात्रा एक तरफ से शुरू हो चुकी है. I don't remember his exact quote, but those were his words. So we are on the path to normalization. We've begun that journey, but we will still be in a situation of armed coexistence.
Understood. In a situation of armed coexistence, Sahib joining us from Carnegie, India, explaining what's happening on the India-China border, how we should look at the meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping of China. Sahib, I'm obliged to you for your time, and also to our viewers for catching us on India Today Global. We'll keep you absolutely updated with what's happening on the India-China border, as well as the broader diplomatic and political relationship between these two countries. Thank you so much for watching.